In the spring of 1998, Hilda Kaufmann lay in a Frankfurt hospital bed with a heart that kept renegotiating its own rhythm. When the monitor chirped, she forced her face into calm because panic stole oxygen from minutes she could not replace. She asked her daughter, Lena, to empty the bedside cabinet so the nurses can reach the towels. And the request sounded ordinary. It turned Lena into an orderly in her mother's last days. It cost Hilda the dignity of watching her life get sorted while she was still alive. Lena knelt, opened the cabinet, and slid out a thick envelope whose flap had been opened and resealed so many times the glue had turned brittle. She set it on the blanket as if it might stain the sheets and unfolded the first page with careful fingers. The papers became a small pile of photocopies, a faded photograph, and a letter typed on American stationery. It cost Hilda a visible tightening in her chest, as if paper could compress breath. Hilda pointed at the photograph and tried to supply a name, but nothing arrived. She swallowed, then said only, "He didn't ask my name," and the sentence landed like a stone. Lena stopped tidying and became still. Hilda paid for the delay with the sick knowledge that she had waited decades too long to make this story easier to carry. She began at the beginning, because she wanted to die owing less. In July 1945, she was 23, a German prisoner doing labor in a vast Allied prisoner of war enclosure in eastern France. Streets laid out like a small town, signs at intersections, workshops, and a clinic inside wire, everything scheduled and counted. Guards called it an enclosure, as if fences were temporary. The camp acted like it was merely holding people. The price was that the camp shaped people by routine so thoroughly that even thinking outside the routine started to feel like a crime. A roster board in the women's compound assigned her to laundry detail. She pushed a cart of wet bedding along a packed dirt lane, passing a carpenter shop where prisoners repaired crates for American units, a chapel whose door stayed open for services that sounded almost normal until you noticed the sentry outside, and a clinic that smelled of disinfectant and boiled cloth. The place functioned like a machine that used captive hands. It cost her the awareness that machines log deviations, and a logged deviation could become punishment. The drying lines sat near the edge of one wire segment, long rows of rope and posts that looked innocent until you saw the guard towers beyond them. On hot days, the air above the lines shimmered, and the wet sheets felt heavy as canvas. Hilda shook a sheet open and pinned it to the rope with wooden clips that snapped shut like small teeth. The cloth spread clean and bright in the sun. The cost was the cold splash of water on her wrists, a reminder that skin was always exposed in captivity. A loudspeaker deeper in the compound crackled and began playing jazz through distortion, followed by a clipped voice reading announcements. Music tried to paste normal life over wire and rifles. That thin cover made work feel almost civilian for a moment. It cost her a more dangerous thought. This might be permanent. Boots came off the perimeter road and into the drying area, slow enough to be deliberate. Hilda did not turn, and she did not lift her chin toward the nameplates guards wore. She offered no invitation and no provocation. The cost was that she denied herself information that could later protect her. A young voice said in casual English that the day was hot. Hilda answered with the smallest nod she could manage while still working. A conversation formed without faces. The price was that any conversation outside orders could be labeled contact, and contact had penalties. She saw his hand move toward the inside pocket of his field jacket and stepped back an inch, careful not to scrape the cart. For a heartbeat, she expected a baton or a folded order, her body prepared for violence. She paid with a shallow breath that tasted like panic. The object he produced was a wallet, worn leather, snapped shut with a metal button. He opened it, pulled out a photograph from behind plastic, and held it out at her chest height. Refusing to look could be read as contempt, so she looked. The cost was that looking up made her visible, and visibility in a camp was never free. In the photograph, a young man grinned too widely for a formal portrait, mouth open as if caught mid-laugh. A woman stood beside him with her hair pinned back, and another young man leaned in at the edge, half in shadow. The guard touched the laughing man with a fingertip and said with flat precision that sounded memorized, "My brother. Private First Class Robert Anderson, 34th Infantry Division." The picture stopped being a keepsake and became an announcement. The cost was that Hilda was being made responsible for how she reacted. Hilda's eyes flicked, despite herself, to the guard's chest. A nameplate sat there, but the sun hit it at an angle, and her own fear kept her from staring. She caught only the first curve of a letter, then looked away, pretending to adjust a clip on the line. The guard spoke again, a few words about home and Minnesota, and she heard the soft, flat vowel of the upper Midwest that she would later recognize only as a texture. She tried to memorize that texture because she could not safely memorize the letters. The result was a clue stored in sound instead of ink. The cost was the risk of being seen looking for anything other than obedience. He turned the photograph over and showed her the back, where dark ink pressed into the paper, 17th of January, 1944, and a line naming Monte Cassino. Hilda's throat tightened, because before capture she had typed lists of units and dates in a communications office, safely behind desks and wires. She had told herself paperwork was not blood. The date made that lie harder to hold. The price was the suspicion that her hands had helped move death, even if they never held a rifle. The guard's fingers trembled slightly as he held the card steady. He did not accuse her of shooting anyone. Instead, he said, almost to himself, that he should hate her. It did not sound like anger. It sounded like a duty he no longer trusted. Hilda heard a man searching for a place to put a hatred he had been issued. The cost was that she could not offer him an enemy he could strike. She forced out a short apology in German, reflex more than sentence, and the sound of it seemed too small for the date he had shown her. He recognized the tone and shook his head once, slow, refusing it, then said in English, "It's not your fault." The punishment she expected did not arrive. She paid with a sharper pain. She could not settle her debt by being hated. He slid the photograph back into the wallet, but stayed in place, staring at the toes of his boots as if he'd lost the next step. He admitted he had enlisted, imagining he would kill Germans when he met them, and then he stopped, ashamed of the simplicity of that plan. After another pause, he added that the prisoners here were not monsters. They were girls hanging sheets and old men fixing crates. Propaganda cracked in the open air between them. The cost was that Hilda could not accept his honesty without feeling her own complicity tighten around her. A whistle blew, sharp and official, followed by shouted instructions, and the guard snapped his wallet shut with a metallic click. He stepped back into posture, eyes forward, uniform returning to him like a mask. Schedule ended the moment before either of them knew what it meant. The price was that Hilda still did not know his name, and she had not dared to ask. She finished the rostered work without missing a clip because mistakes drew attention. That night, attention arrived anyway, in the form of an escort and an office that smelled of cigarettes and ink. Captain Merrill, an intelligence officer attached to the enclosure, did not ask what happened. He described unauthorized contact as something already filed. He pushed a typed statement across the desk and placed a pen beside it. A private moment was being converted into an official narrative. The cost was that Hilda could not prove what had been said, only what could be written. Merrill tapped the paper with 2 knuckles and said the camp had obligations under the Geneva Convention and that security required clear statements. He spoke as if law were a blanket covering his threats, and he pointed to the heading, an enclosure report number stamped in purple ink, so she would understand how easily a sentence could become permanent. Hilda read the stamp, then lowered her eyes, refusing to give him the satisfaction of watching her flinch. The result was a clear lesson that the war continued on paper after gunfire ended. The cost was knowing paper could punish her more efficiently than any witness. The paper claimed she had approached the sentry with questions about troop movements and that the sentry had distracted her with a photograph. Merrill spoke slowly, as if patience were kindness, and said cooperation would be remembered when labor assignments were made. He implied refusal could be interpreted as training, sabotage, or manipulation. She was being placed inside a legal box where every answer had a wrong edge. The price was the loss of any safe way to explain the truth. Hilda kept her hands in her lap and answered only what could not be twisted. She had been working. A sentry had commented about the heat, and she did not know his name. Merrill asked again, then again, in a new order, as if rearrangement could produce confession. Hilda repeated her safe facts until her throat burned. She refused without making a speech. The cost was the punishment that followed. Latrine duty, reduced mail, and a quiet warning that files are permanent. Back in the barracks, she pulled a small notebook from where she had hidden it inside her bedding and wrote down what she could. Minnesota, 21. Robert Anderson, January 17, 1944. Monte Cassino. And 2 letters she was not sure she had earned. E.R. She built a private record to oppose the camp's record. The cost was that written memory became contraband, and she would carry it like a weapon she could not use. If you want the rest of this story, tap like and follow wherever you're listening. Your small action helps these quiet histories reach other people, and it cost you only a second. Latrine duty was punishment designed to isolate without bruising. Hilda hauled buckets at the far end of the compound where guards could watch from a distance and speak only in orders. She stopped seeing the laundry lines where the wallet had opened. The cost was that memory grew louder when she had no new sights to overwrite it. Some women in her barracks avoided her after Merrill's interrogations, not from cruelty, but from caution. Attention was contagious, and contagious attention was dangerous. Hilda did not argue with them. She kept her eyes low and did her assigned tasks. The result was survival through dullness. The cost was loneliness that felt like another fence built inside her ribs. When she rotated back to regular details, the young guard was still there, but he no longer stepped off his patrol. He kept his face forward and his posture rigid, as if a warning had been given to him too. Discipline arrived as distance. Whatever he had tried to hand her, his brother's weight, fell back onto him alone. She paid with the helplessness of watching someone be corrected by a system she could not touch. By late July, the camp felt differently charged. Soldiers argued near administrative huts, and words like points, home, and shipment drifted into prisoner hearing through cracked doors and careless mouths. A bilingual prisoner explained that the Americans were using a point system to decide who was discharged and who was reassigned, and that men with low points could be sent to another theater even after Europe was won. Hilda finally had a practical reason for the guard's tremor. Victory had not freed him. The cost was realizing that even the winners were still being moved by orders. Captain Merrill called her in once more. He changed the order of questions, as if rearrangement could produce a different reality, and he hinted the sentry could be punished unless Hilda confirmed the typed story. He offered her an easier work detail if she cooperated. Hilda answered only in safe fragments. She worked, as sentry commented on heat. She returned to work, and gave him nothing that could hang anyone. She protected her bottom line and refused to become a tool. The cost was another week of unfavorable duties that reminded her power was exercised through small humiliations. In early August, trucks lined the camp's main road, engines idling in a dusty chorus, and transfer notices appeared on boards the prisoners could see but not read well. A work detail was ordered to stand near a fence while the convoy formed, and Hilda obeyed, keeping her face blank. Futures were being assigned like freight. Her reward for obedience was witnessing. The cost was the way helplessness makes time feel longer. She saw the young guard among soldiers carrying duffel bags, rifle slung, cap pulled low. He climbed into the back of a truck and then turned his head as if pulled by a string. His eyes swept the line of workers with the urgency of a man needing a human face before leaving, and they landed on her. He lifted his hand in a slow, uncertain wave, holding it there too long, like he was waiting for something that would settle him. Hilda's own hand rose halfway, then stopped, suspended by fear and by the memory of Merrill's file. The truck lurched, the convoy began to move, and she let her hand fall without a word. A farewell happened without names. The cost was that silence became the last thing she gave him. That night she wrote the wave into her notebook and added what she wished she had asked: his rank, his unit, his full name. The next day she tried to ask another guard about the Minnesota boy, and received only a stare and an order to return to work. Anonymity revealed itself as a product the camp manufactured well. The cost was the realization that fragments do not locate a person outside wire. For several days after the convoy, she searched for him the way prisoners searched for any missing thing, indirectly. She watched guards change shifts and listened for accents, hoping to catch the same Minnesota vowel. She studied the corner of a posted duty roster from a distance, not close enough to be accused of spying, and saw the name Anderson once among many others. The sight gave her a brief surge of certainty, then collapsed under its own commonness. The result was false hope that left her emptier than before. The cost was learning that common names can erase a person as efficiently as silence. Merrill's file did not disappear when the guard did. The officer kept her under mild suspicion, assigning her to duties that limited contact and reminding her that security was an elastic word. Hilda understood his leverage came from the same thing she lacked: names and paper trails. She began to treat survival as a paperwork war. The cost was constant calculation, which erodes the mind in small bites. She took one more risk to blunt the file. When a Red Cross liaison made a routine pass, clipboard in hand, Hilda slid a folded note into a laundry list she was ordered to deliver, stating she had been pressured to sign a false statement and that punishment was being used to coerce compliance. The liaison offered no promises and did not show emotion, but the interrogation stopped afterward, and Merrill's attention cooled into irritation rather than pursuit. Procedure, not heroism, reduced the officer's leverage. The cost was that the file still existed, because institutions rarely erase what they have already written. Hilda left captivity in stages: processing centers, train transfers, forms stamped by strangers, and returned to a Germany patched together from broken stone. Frankfurt streets were filled with temporary repairs and permanent absences. She rebuilt a civilian life by speaking only the safe versions of war, because safe versions did not attract questions. The result was a functioning home, work as a translator, and later a child who grew up with routines. The cost was that the one story that mattered most stayed locked in a notebook, because it was not safe. Years passed, then decades, and the notebook followed her through moves, births, and funerals. Each summer, when she shook wet sheets and heard water snap off fabric, her body replayed the wallet's metal click and the boot's scraping gravel. The camp became portable, carried in sound. The cost was a small tax of breath, and shame paid again and again for ordinary chores. By the early 1980s, the war had become an anniversary people could talk about in documentaries and ceremonies. Hilda found herself reading about Italy and Monte Cassino, as if the mountain still stood between the living and their dead, and the date on the photograph began to feel less like a wound and more like a clue that demanded a responsible kind of action. She could no longer pretend the notebook was only private. The cost was the risk of disturbing the stability she had built for Lena. In the winter of 1985, with Lena grown and her German life stable enough to risk interruption, Hilda copied the fragments onto clean paper and chose the least invasive path she could imagine: records, not people. She wrote to an American records office in careful English, enclosed proof of identity, and waited weeks for slow mail to decide whether she deserved an answer. Private memory entered a public system. The cost was surrendering timing because bureaucracy does not hurry for a stranger's remorse. A packet arrived with forms and typed lines, and it included an apologetic note. Many service files had been lost in a 1973 fire, so some requests could only be partially fulfilled. Official memory, she learned, can burn like any other. The cost was that paper could never be a complete substitute for the name she failed to ask. The partial fulfillment did not satisfy her, so she did what translators do. She triangulated. She spent an afternoon in the reading room of a local American cultural office, requesting published unit histories and old maps. She found the 34th Infantry Division's path through Italy, described in clean sentences that made the war sound orderly. Mountain villages, ridgelines, winter rain, artillery coordinates. Monte Cassino appeared as a name on a page and as a photograph of shattered stone. The result was context that made Robert Anderson real beyond a date. The cost was realizing that more context still did not reveal the living brother's name. Still, the packet contained what she needed most, a casualty entry confirming Robert Anderson's death and listing next of kin. A mother, Irene Anderson, in Red Wing, Minnesota. Hilda wrote a letter to Irene and rewrote it until the language was small enough not to wound. She stated only that in 1945, in a camp in France, an American soldier had shown her Robert's photograph and had not been cruel. She enclosed a picture of herself from that year as proof she was not a ghost. She sent a fact across an ocean. The cost was that sending it made the fact more real, and real things can return with consequences. For 6 weeks, she lived by the sound of the building mailbox, because anticipation creates its own form of captivity. When the reply came, it was from a law office, not a home. The lawyer stated Irene Anderson had died in 1980 and enclosed a copy of a family photograph from the 1960s. Robert in uniform beside a younger brother, both posed stiffly as if for a church bulletin. He added that Irene had kept Robert's belongings, including a Bible worn thin at the edges. Hilda received proof the brother in the wallet had lived, and that a mother had preserved her dead son's objects. The cost was the sting of arriving too late to speak to Irene, who might have answered the question without fear. Hilda considered writing back to ask the obvious question, who was he? Had he ever spoken of the camp? But consequences stacked up in her mind. Alarm, suspicion, being treated as a threat or a manipulator. She photocopied the letter and photograph, stapled the copies into the notebook cover, and stopped writing to America. Restraint became her final action in that direction. The cost was acceptance that the missing name would remain missing by her own choice, and that the search would end where all searches end when people are careful. Inside a folder. Back in the Frankfurt hospital in 1998, Lena listened as Hilda told the story without romantic words because romance would have been a lie. Lena asked why her mother had not asked his name when he waved from the truck, and Hilda admitted the simplest truth. In a camp, names create relationships, and relationships can become charges. Lena understood her mother's silence as a survival tactic. The cost was seeing how survival can also amputate possibility. Lena asked whether Hilda was sure the brother in the 1960s photograph was the same man. Hilda answered that she could not be sure in the way courts require, but she was sure in the way bodies remember. Eyes, posture, the angle and hesitation of a wave. Uncertainty became part of the record rather than a flaw. The cost was that the story would never become clean proof with a tidy conclusion. Hilda explained what the missing name had done to her. Hatred needs maintenance, she said, and maintenance needs a hook, a name to repeat until the world narrows around it. She feared that if she learned his name, she could hate properly, and the war would own the rest of her life through that hook. Not knowing had been a kind of escape. The cost was paying for escape with incompletion and with a lifetime of small triggers. With the urgency of someone watching the corridor narrow, Hilda turned her last strength into instructions. She wanted the notebook and the American correspondence donated to a German archive for custody, but with a restriction period so it could not be used for spectacle while living people might still be harmed by it. She built a boundary out of paperwork, the one tool she had always understood. The cost was that Lena inherited boundary enforcement as a duty, not a choice. Hilda also asked for one line to be carved on the back of her grave marker, not the front, so it would not become a public banner. Lena wrote it down, read it back, and watched her mother correct a word with a thin smile. The sentence became stable enough to outlive breath. The cost was that a sentence cannot replace a missing name. Hilda died in November 1998, and the death certificate reduced her ending to heart failure, a phrase that could not hold the weight of 53 years of unnamed memory. Lena carried out the instructions, signed deposit paperwork at an archive office, and arranged the restriction period as her mother requested. Hilda's story entered the world as a quiet artifact. The cost was that quiet artifacts do not defend themselves against misunderstanding, and they rely on caretakers who may one day be tired. At the archive office, an archivist asked Lena for identifiers, full names, dates, places, key words that would help future researchers. Lena handed over the envelope and watched the archivist's pen hover at the line for the American guard's name. She wrote unknown, then added Minnesota accent, brother killed near Casino, because that was all Hilda had ever been able to preserve. The story entered the archive with a blank where institutions prefer certainty. The cost was that Lena had to sign beside that blank, making absence look official. In 2001, a note reached the cemetery office, tucked into the visitor ledger between entries about flowers and maintenance. The clerk told Lena because the grave's hidden inscription had made it memorable. An American man, German with an American accent, had said his father once stood guard at a prisoner camp in France and spoke late in life about a German girl who listened to him. An echo arrived too late for Hilda, offered without a signature. The cost was temptation, because an echo can feel like a door. Lena held the note and felt a choice sharpen inside her: chase the accent through a city of tourists, or treat the message as what her mother had always treated names as, a hook that can trap a life. She copied the message onto a blank notebook page, dated it, and filed the original behind the lawyer's letter. Preservation replaced pursuit. The cost was accepting that the story would remain human and incomplete. At the grave, Lena stood close enough to read the line on the back of the stone and listened to ordinary sounds: gravel under shoes, wind through trees, distant traffic, sounds that did not belong to war. She understood what her mother had paid for: the right to stop maintaining hatred. The cost was that the price of that right was a gap that would never be filled, because in the summer of 1945 they said what they could, and the rest was left unnamed.